The shovel scraped against frozen earth with a sound that cut through the winter silence like a prayer nobody wanted to hear. Grace Turner's hands were raw and bleeding through her torn gloves, her dark hair plastered against her face with snow and sweat, and when the cowboy rode up that desolate stretch of mountain pass in the Arizona high country, he thought for a moment he was seeing a ghost digging her own grave. "Madam?" Garrett Lancaster's voice carried across the wind as he dismounted, his boots crunching in the snow that shouldn't have been falling this hard in Arizona, but the winter of 1883 had been proving everyone wrong about what weather could do. "Madam, what are you doing out here?" She didn't look up, just kept digging with mechanical precision, her dress torn and muddied, a heavy coat that was clearly a man's draped over her shoulders. "My husband died 3 miles back," she said, her voice flat and distant like she was reporting the weather. "The wagon went over. He didn't make it. I need to bury him before the wolves come." Garrett looked past her and saw the travois she'd somehow constructed, the body wrapped in blankets, and his heart clenched in his chest. He'd seen death before, plenty of it, but there was something about this woman's determined grief that hit him different. She couldn't have been more than 23, 24 at most, and she was alone on a mountain pass in a snowstorm trying to dig a grave in ground that was near frozen solid. "Madam, you can't bury someone out here like this," he said gently, approaching slowly like she was a wounded animal that might bolt. "The ground's too hard, and you're going to freeze to death trying." "Then I'll freeze," she said simply, and kept digging. The hole was barely a foot deep after what must have been hours of work. Her shoulders shook with more than just cold. Garrett made a decision that would change everything. He stepped forward and put his hand on the shovel, stopping her mid-swing. "Let me help you, please. But not here. There's a town about 7 miles north, Jerome Junction. They've got a proper cemetery, a minister. Your husband deserves that, doesn't he?" For the first time, she looked up at him, and her eyes were the color of storm clouds, gray and full of lightning that hadn't struck yet. Tears had frozen on her cheeks in tiny crystalline tracks. "I don't have money for a proper burial. I don't have money for anything. Everything went over the cliff with the wagon except what I could carry." "Then I'll pay for it," Garrett said, and he meant it, even though his own funds were limited, even though he'd been heading south to find work on a ranch, even though every practical bone in his body told him to ride on by and let tragedy be someone else's problem for once. Nobody should have to dig a grave alone in the snow. Something in her broke then, just a little, just enough that the shovel slipped from her hands and she swayed on her feet. Garrett caught her before she fell, steadying her with his hands on her arms, and up close he could see how exhausted she was, how her lips were turning blue, how she was running on nothing but determination and grief. "When did you last eat?" he asked. "Yesterday morning. Maybe. I don't remember." She pulled away from him, wrapping her arms around herself. "I can't leave him out here alone." "You won't. I'll help you get him on my horse. We'll take him to Jerome Junction together. I promise you, madam, I won't leave you out here." Garrett kept his voice steady and calm, the same tone he used with spooked horses. "But if you stay out here much longer, there'll be 2 graves to dig instead of 1. She looked at the wrapped body on the travois, then at the pathetic hole she'd managed to scrape into the frozen ground, then back at Garrett's weathered face. He was maybe 27 or 28, with dark blonde hair and eyes that were a surprising shade of green, honest eyes that didn't look away from difficult things. "I don't even know your name," she said. "Garrett Lancaster. And you are?" "Grace Turner," she hesitated. "Grace Holloway, I suppose. That was his name. Holloway. How long were you married, Mrs. Holloway?" 6 months. Her voice cracked. "We were heading to California, new start. He had family there, a brother who owned an orchard. We left Missouri in September. Should have waited until spring, but James, he was so sure we could beat the winter." She laughed, a broken sound. "He was wrong." Garrett nodded slowly. "A lot of good people have been wrong about what these mountains can do. It's not his fault. It's not yours either." He looked up at the darkening sky, at the snow that was falling harder now. "But we need to move, Mrs. Holloway. We need to get you warm and get your husband to town before this storm gets worse." She nodded, numb and compliant suddenly, all the fight draining out of her. Garrett worked quickly, securing the body to his horse with rope, talking gently to the animal to keep it calm. He fashioned a better covering from his own bedroll and made sure everything was secure. Then He helped Grace up into the saddle and climbed up behind her, one arm around her waist to keep her steady. "Hold on to me," he said. "I won't let you fall." She leaned back against his chest, and he could feel how she was shaking, her whole body trembling with cold and shock. He urged the horse forward, back the way he'd come, toward Jerome Junction and whatever came next. The ride took 3 hours through worsening weather. Grace drifted in and out of consciousness, and Garrett kept talking to her, asking her questions, forcing her to stay awake because he was terrified that if she fell asleep, she wouldn't wake up again. He learned that she'd grown up in Missouri, daughter of a schoolteacher. She'd married James Holloway after a brief courtship, swayed by his enthusiasm and dreams of California. She'd been scared to make the journey, but had believed in him, trusted him. "He was a good man," she said at one point, her words slurring. "Not practical, but good. Kind. He deserved better than this." "I'm sure he did," Garrett said, and he meant it, even though he'd never met the man, even though all he could think about was how warm Grace felt against him, despite the cold, how right it felt to hold her, even though it was all wrong, even though she was a widow of maybe 6 hours and he had no business thinking anything at all. Jerome Junction appeared out of the snow like a miracle, lights glowing in windows, smoke rising from chimneys. It was a mining town, copper mostly, built into the side of the mountain with narrow streets and sturdy buildings designed to withstand harsh winters. Garrett rode straight to the undertaker's establishment, a small building on the edge of town run by a man named Cornelius Webb, who also served as the town's minister when needed. Cornelius came out when Garrett knocked, took one look at the situation, and asked no questions except the necessary ones. Yes, he could prepare the body for burial. Yes, he could arrange a service. Yes, he had a spare room where the lady could rest. Garrett paid him half up front and promised the rest within the week. Then, he took Grace to the boarding house run by Mrs. Eleanor Davies, a stern-faced woman with a soft heart who took one look at Grace's condition and started issuing orders like a general. Hot bath, warm food, clean clothes, and bed. Garrett waited downstairs in the parlor, drinking coffee Mrs. Davies forced on him, staring at the fire and wondering what he'd gotten himself into. An hour later, Mrs. Davies came back down. "She's sleeping. Poor thing couldn't even finish her soup before she dropped off. I've never seen someone so exhausted." She studied Garrett with sharp eyes. "You did a good thing bringing her in. Another hour in that storm and she'd be dead." "Her husband?" "Webb will take care of him. Burial will be day after tomorrow, assuming the storm passes. You planning to stay?" "Yes," Garrett said without hesitation. "Someone should be there for the service." Mrs. Davies smiled slightly. "You're a good man, Mr. Lancaster. Your room's at the end of the hall, 2nd floor. Clean linens, pitcher of water. Breakfast at 7. Garrett thanked her and headed up to his room, but he didn't sleep much. He kept thinking about Grace, about the determination in her eyes when she'd been digging that grave, about the weight of her grief, about the sound of her voice when she'd said her husband had been kind. He barely knew her, but he felt responsible for her now, like finding her in the snow had tied their fates together somehow. The storm raged for 2 days. Garrett stayed close to the boarding house, checking on Grace when Mrs. Davies allowed it, which wasn't often. "She's grieving," the landlady said firmly. "She needs time." But on the morning of the funeral, Grace came downstairs dressed in a black dress Mrs. Davies had found somewhere, her dark hair pulled back severely, her face pale but composed. "Mr. Lancaster," she said when she saw him, "you stayed." "Of course," he said, standing quickly. "I told you I'd see this through. You've done more than enough, paid for the burial, brought me here. I can't repay you." "I don't want repayment." He hesitated. "How are you?" "I don't know," she said honestly. "Empty, but standing. That's something." She looked toward the window, where weak sunlight was finally breaking through clouds. "Is it time?" The service was small. Garrett, Grace, Mrs. Davies, Cornelius Webb, and a few curious townspeople who came to any funeral out of respect for death itself. Cornelius said words about dust and ashes, about the journey home, about God's mercy. Grace stood silent, her hands folded, tears running down her face but making no sound. When it came time to throw dirt on the coffin, her hand shook so badly she dropped the handful before it reached the grave. Garrett stepped close and offered his arm. She took it, leaning on him as the coffin was covered, as the mound of earth grew, as her husband disappeared into the Arizona ground, far from where they'd started, and even farther from where they'd meant to go. Afterward, Mrs. Davies invited everyone back for coffee and cake, the traditional funeral reception. Grace sat in the parlor and accepted condolences from people who'd never met her husband, who knew nothing about their story except what they'd heard whispered through town. Garrett stayed nearby, not hovering but present, and when an older miner started asking too many questions about what Grace planned to do now, Garrett smoothly redirected the conversation. When everyone finally left, Grace looked at him with something like gratitude mixed with despair. "What do I do now?" she asked quietly. "I have no money, no family within 1,000 miles, no way to get anywhere even if I knew where to go. James had $40 in his pocket when we left the last town. It went over the cliff with everything else." "You take time," Garrett said. "You rest. You figure things out one day at a time. I need to work. I can't impose on Mrs. Davis's charity forever. Can you cook? Sew? Keep books?" Garrett was thinking fast, running through what he knew about Jerome Junction's economy, about who needed help. "I can do all of those. I can teach. I can clean. I'm not afraid of hard work, Mr. Lancaster." "Garrett," he said, "please, I think we're past formality." She almost smiled. "Garrett, then. And you can call me Grace, though it feels strange. I've been Mrs. Holloway for 6 months, and now I'm just Grace again." Mrs. Davies, who'd been clearing dishes and definitely listening, spoke up. "I might know of something. Maggie Chen, who runs the restaurant on Main Street, was just saying yesterday she needed help. Her daughter moved to Tucson, and she can't manage the lunch rush alone anymore. It's hard work, long hours, but she pays fair and feeds her staff." Grace straightened. "Could you introduce me? Today? Eager thing, aren't you?" But Mrs. Davies's tone was approving. "Give yourself a day to breathe, child. Tomorrow's soon enough." That night, Garrett found himself in the saloon, nursing a whiskey and talking to the bartender, a man named Sullivan, who knew everything about everyone. "You're the one who brought in the widow," Sullivan said, not quite a question. "I found her on the mountain pass." "Lucky thing you did. What's your interest there?" "No interest," Garrett said quickly. "Just being decent." Sullivan raised an eyebrow. "Sure. That's why you haven't left town yet, even though you told me 3 days ago you were heading south to the Lazy K for work." "I'll go when I know she's settled." "Uh-huh," Sullivan grinned. "She's a pretty woman. Sad, but pretty." "She just buried her husband." Garrett's voice had an edge to it. "And grief doesn't last forever. I'm not saying you should court her tomorrow, Lancaster. I'm saying maybe you're staying for a reason, and maybe it's not just being decent." Sullivan shrugged. "Or maybe I'm full of it. Drink your whiskey." Garrett did, but Sullivan's words stuck with him. He wasn't interested in Grace that way, was he? She was grieving. She was vulnerable. The last thing she needed was some cowboy developing feelings for her out of some misguided savior complex. He resolved to help her get on her feet and then leave town like he'd planned. It was the right thing to do, the decent thing. But the next morning, when he saw Grace heading to the restaurant to meet with Maggie Chen, he found himself walking the same direction. And when she got the job and came out smiling for the first time since he'd met her, he felt something warm bloom in his chest that had nothing to do with decency. "I start tomorrow," she told him, slightly breathless. 6 days a week, mornings through afternoon. She's going to teach me her recipes, let me help with the cooking and serving. It's enough to pay Mrs. Davies for the room and have a little left over." "That's wonderful," Garrett said, and he meant it. "I'm glad." "It's because of you," Grace said seriously. "All of this. You saved my life up there on that mountain, and you've helped me every step since. I don't know how to thank you." "You don't need to thank me." "I do, though. You could have ridden past. Most people would have." Garrett didn't know what to say to that, so he just nodded. They walked back to the boarding house together, and he found himself matching his stride to hers, found himself wanting to make her smile again, found himself in trouble. The days developed a rhythm. Grace worked at the restaurant, learning Maggie Chen's fusion cooking that combined traditional American fare with flavors from Maggie's Chinese heritage, creating dishes unique to Jerome Junction. Garrett found work at the lumber yard, hauling timber down from the mountain forests that surrounded the town. It was hard physical labor that paid decent and kept him too tired to overthink things. They saw each other at breakfast at the boarding house, and sometimes in the evenings when Garrett would stop by the restaurant for dinner and sit at the counter watching Grace work. She was good with customers, patient and kind, and her smile came more easily as the weeks passed. The shadows under her eyes faded. The haunted look diminished. 6 weeks after the funeral, she served him coffee and said, "You're still here." "I'm still here," he agreed. "Why?" "I thought you had a job waiting down south." "I wrote them. Told them I found other work." He wrapped his hands around the coffee cup. "Jerome Junction's not a bad place." "It's not," she agreed, wiping down the counter. "I didn't expect to stay here, but Mrs. Davies is kind. Maggie is teaching me so much, and the people are good. It feels safe." "You deserve safe." She looked at him then, really looked at him, and something passed between them that made Garrett's breath catch. "Do you want to walk with me after my shift? It's supposed to be clear tonight, and I haven't seen the stars properly in weeks." "I'd like that," Garrett said, his heart hammering. That evening they walked up the hillside above town, where the mine tailings gave way to scrub brush and pine trees. The stars were brilliant in the cold March air, and Grace tipped her head back to look at them, her breath making clouds in the darkness. "James loved the stars," she said softly. "He could name all the constellations. I could never keep them straight." Garrett tensed, waiting, but Grace continued. "I miss him, but not in the way I expected. I miss who I thought we'd become together more than who we actually were." "Does that make sense?" "I think so. We married so fast. We barely knew each other. He was charming and enthusiastic, and I was lonely and scared of being unmarried forever. My mother died when I was 19, and my father remarried a year later to a woman who made it clear I was in the way. James seemed like an escape, an adventure." She wrapped her arms around herself. "I cared for him. I would have made it work. But I don't think we were in love, not really. And I feel guilty for thinking that now that he's gone." "You can care about someone and still be honest about what you had," Garrett said carefully. "That doesn't make his death less sad or your grief less real. Is it wrong that I'm starting to feel like myself again? That some days I forget to be sad?" "No," Garrett said firmly. "It's not wrong. It's human. You're allowed to heal, Grace." She turned to him, and in the starlight her eyes were bright. "You've been so patient with me. So kind." "Why?" "Because you needed someone to be," he said simply. And then because he couldn't help it, because he'd been wanting to say it for weeks, he added, "And because I like you. I like talking to you. I like seeing you get stronger. I like who you are." Grace stepped closer, close enough that he could see the pulse jumping in her throat. "I like you too, Garrett Lancaster. And that terrifies me." "Why?" "Because it's too soon. Because people will talk. Because I don't know if what I'm feeling is real or just gratitude or just loneliness." She looked down. "And because you're a good man and you deserve better than someone else's widow who comes with so much grief and confusion." Garrett reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "What if I think you're worth all of that?" "Then you're a fool," she whispered, but she was leaning into his touch. "Probably," he agreed, and he wanted to kiss her so badly it hurt, but he didn't. Instead, he dropped his hand and stepped back. "You're right that it's soon. But Grace, I'm not going anywhere. When you're ready, if you're ever ready, I'm here." She nodded, eyes bright with unshed tears, and they walked back down to town in charged silence. Spring came to Jerome Junction with sudden ferocity. Snow melting in rushing streams down the mountainside, wildflowers erupting from ground that had been frozen weeks before. The town came alive with energy, mines working full shifts, merchants doing brisk business, the restaurant packed every lunch and dinner. Grace bloomed too. She gained weight, lost the gaunt look that hunger and grief had carved into her. She laughed more easily. Maggie Chen started letting her experiment with recipes, and Grace discovered she had a talent for baking, particularly fruit pies that became the restaurant's signature dessert. She took a room above the restaurant instead of staying at the boarding house, gaining more independence, starting to build a real life. Garrett watched it all and fell deeper in love with every passing day. He courted her carefully, respectfully, always giving her space but making his intentions clear. He walked her home from work, He fixed things in her room that needed fixing. He brought her books from the general store and listened to her read passages aloud that struck her. He made her laugh with stories from his past, his childhood on a ranch in Texas, his years working cattle drives, the characters he'd met along the way. 3 months after the funeral, he finally kissed her. It was evening, and they were sitting on the bench outside the restaurant after closing, and Grace was talking about it maybe starting a small garden in the plot behind the building, and Garrett was watching her face, the way her hands moved when she talked, and he just couldn't stand it anymore. "Grace," he said, interrupting her mid-sentence about tomato varieties. "What?" She turned to him startled. "Can I kiss you?" Her eyes went wide, then soft. Then she smiled, that brilliant smile he'd been trying to earn since the mountain pass. Yes. He kissed her gently, just a soft press of lips, but it felt like something clicking into place, like a door opening that had been closed. When he pulled back, Grace's eyes were closed and she was still smiling. "That was nice," she whispered. "Can I do it again?" "You'd better." This time the kiss deepened, and Grace's hands came up to his shoulders, and Garrett wrapped his arms around her waist and pulled her closer. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Grace laughed, a sound of pure joy. "I was so scared," she admitted, "scared that I wouldn't feel anything, that grief had broken that part of me. But Garrett, I feel everything with you. Too much sometimes." "Is that bad?" "No," she said and kissed him again. "It's perfect." They courted properly after that, though of course people talked. The widow and her cowboy, they said in the saloon and the shops. It's too soon, the more conservative townspeople said. But others, like Mrs. Davies and Maggie Chen, smiled and said it was about time, that Grace deserved happiness, that Garrett was a good man who'd proven himself. 4 months after that first kiss, Garrett asked Grace to marry him. He didn't have a ring yet, couldn't afford the one he wanted to give her, so he did it with just words and hope. They were riding horses he'd borrowed up into the mountains to a meadow full of summer wildflowers, and he helped her down from the saddle and just said it straight out. "Grace Turner, I love you. I want to marry you, build a life with you, grow old with you. I know it's fast, and I know your past is complicated, but I don't care about any of that. I just care about you and me and what we could be together. Will you marry me?" Grace stared at him, eyes wide, and for a terrible moment Garrett thought she'd say no. But then she laughed and threw her arms around his neck. "Yes, yes, of course, yes, I love you, Garrett Lancaster. I love you so much it scares me sometimes, how much I love you." He picked her up and spun her around, both of them laughing like children, and when he set her down he kissed her like he'd been wanting to for months, deeply and thoroughly, until they were both dizzy with it. They married in September of 1884, a year and a half after Garrett had found Grace on that mountain pass. Cornelius Webb performed the ceremony in the same church where James Holloway's funeral had been held, and if that struck some people as odd, Grace and Garrett didn't care. "The past was the past," Grace said firmly. "James would want me to be happy," she said, and she believed it. The whole town turned out for the wedding. Mrs. Davies cried. Maggie Chen made an elaborate cake. The miners got drunk and rowdy at the reception in the saloon, and Garrett's friends from the lumberyard played fiddle and guitar while people danced in the street. Grace wore a cream-colored dress she'd sewn herself, with lace at the collar and cuffs, and Garrett wore his best clothes and couldn't stop staring at his bride like she was the most miraculous thing he'd ever seen. "I found you in the snow," he said during their first dance, holding her close. "Thought you were a ghost." "I might as well have been," Grace said. "I was barely alive. You brought me back, Garrett. You saved me in every way a person can be saved." "We saved each other," he corrected. "I was drifting before I met you, working but not living. You gave me a reason to stay in one place, to build something." And build they did. Garrett quit the lumberyard and used his savings, combined with Grace's earnings and a loan from the bank, to buy a small ranch property just outside town. It wasn't much, just a house that needed work and 20 acres of grazing land, but it was theirs. They spent their first year of marriage fixing up the house, painting and repairing, making it a home. Grace kept working at the restaurant part-time, while Garrett started building a herd, buying cattle and horses, learning ranching from neighboring property owners who were generous with advice. Life was hard but good. They worked from dawn to dusk most days, fell into bed exhausted, made love under quilts. Grace sewed from fabric scraps, dreamed out loud about the future they were building together. Some mornings Garrett would wake before dawn and just watch Grace sleep, marveling that she was his wife, that this was his life. Their first child came in the spring of 1886, a son they named Gabriel Thomas Lancaster. Grace labored for 14 hours, with Garrett pacing outside and Mrs. Davies attending. And when he finally heard the baby cry, Garrett burst into the room despite Mrs. Davies's protests. Grace was exhausted and sweaty and radiant, holding their son against her chest, and Garrett knelt beside the bed with tears streaming down his face. "We made a person," Grace said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Garrett, we made a person." "He's perfect," Garrett whispered, touching one tiny fist with his finger. "You're perfect. God, Grace, I love you so much." Fatherhood changed Garrett in ways he didn't expect. He became more cautious, less willing to take risks with the ranch or himself. This child depended on him, and Grace depended on him, and he felt the weight of that responsibility in every decision. But it was good weight, purposeful weight. He worked harder, planned better, and the ranch started to prosper. Grace proved to be a natural mother despite her fears. She nursed Gabriel while managing the household, the garden she'd finally planted, the chickens she had insisted they get. She sang to the baby in a voice Garrett had never heard her use before, soft and sweet, old songs from her childhood mixed with new ones she made up. Gabriel was 2 when Grace told Garrett she was pregnant again. They were sitting on the porch, watching the sunset, Gabriel asleep in Grace's lap, and she just said it casually like she was mentioning the weather. "I'm expecting again. Should be around Christmas if my calculations are right." Garrett whooped and grabbed her carefully, mindful of the sleeping child, and kissed her soundly. "Another baby. Grace, that's wonderful." "Are you happy? I know money's tight and the ranch is demanding and another mouth to feed is—" "I'm thrilled," he interrupted. "We'll manage. We always do." Their daughter arrived on December 20th, 1888, a healthy, screaming baby girl they named Jillian Marie Lancaster. She had Grace's dark hair and Garrett's green eyes, and Gabriel was fascinated by his new sister, wanting to touch her constantly until Grace had to teach him gentle hands. Life settled into a new normal of feeding schedules and diaper changes and sleepless nights, but Garrett wouldn't have changed it for anything. He'd come to Arizona Territory looking for ranch work and found a family instead, found a purpose, found a home. The years passed in the way years do when life is full and busy. Gabriel grew into a serious, thoughtful boy who loved the horses and followed Garrett everywhere. Jillian was her mother's daughter, creative and determined, always making up stories and putting on shows for the family. The ranch grew profitable enough that they could hire hands during busy seasons. Grace stopped working at the restaurant entirely, focusing on the children and the household, though she still made pies for Maggie to sell. They had conflicts, of course. Grace sometimes got frustrated with Garrett's stubbornness about new ranching techniques. Garrett sometimes felt overwhelmed by the demands of family and work. They argued about money, about how to discipline the children, about whether to expand the ranch or stay small. But they always talked it through, always went to bed as partners even when they disagreed, always remembered that they'd chosen each other and that choice mattered more than any individual argument. On their 10th wedding anniversary in 1894, Garrett arranged for Mrs. Davies to watch the children and took Grace back to the meadow where he'd proposed. It looked just the same, wildflowers swaying in the breeze, mountains rising in the distance, sky impossibly blue. 10 years, Grace said, turning in a slow circle. "How's it possible it's been 10 years?" "Best 10 years of my life," Garrett said, pulling her close. "Every single day with you has been a gift, Grace. Even the days we fought about you tracking mud through my clean kitchen." She was teasing, eyes bright. "Especially those days," he said seriously, "because even angry, even frustrated, I never doubted that I loved you or that you loved me. That's worth everything." Grace kissed him then, soft and sweet and full of 10 years of love and partnership. "I was dying when you found me on that mountain," she said softly. "Not just freezing, but dying inside. James's death broke something in me, but more than that, I think I'd been breaking for a long time, pretending to be happy when I was just lost. You didn't just save my life, Garrett. You helped me find myself, helped me become who I was always meant to be. You did the same for me, Garrett said. I was just drifting before you, going wherever the work was, never putting down roots. You taught me what home means, what love means. You and Gabriel and Jillian, you're my whole world. They made love in that meadow like they were young and courting again, tender and passionate, reaffirming vows they'd taken a decade before. Afterward, lying in the crushed wildflowers with Grace's head on his shoulder, Garrett felt completely content in a way he'd never imagined possible that cold winter day when he'd ridden up on a desperate woman trying to bury her husband in frozen ground. Their third child, another son named Gregory James Lancaster, arrived in the spring of 1895. Grace insisted on the middle name despite Garrett's hesitation, saying that James Holloway deserved to be remembered, that his death had inadvertently led to their meeting, to their family. It was a gracious gesture, and Garrett loved her more for it. Gregory was an easy baby compared to his siblings, content to sleep and eat and observe the world with wide, curious eyes. Gabriel and Jillian doted on him, fighting over who got to hold him, who got to help with feeding and changing. The house felt full and loud and perfect. Jerome Junction changed around them too. The mines were starting to play out, some closing, people moving on to other boom towns. But the Lancaster ranch was stable, diversified enough with cattle and horses and some farming that they weren't dependent on mining economy. Other families stayed too, the ones with roots, the ones who'd made lives that went deeper than mineral extraction. Garrett became respected in the community, served on the town council, helped mediate disputes between ranchers and miners. Grace was known for her generosity, always the first to show up when someone was sick or had a baby, always bringing food and help and kindness. The children thrived, growing up with the freedom of ranch life, but also the structure of schooling and church and community expectations. In 1899, Gabriel turned 13 and asked his father to teach him to handle the ranch finances. Garrett was so proud he nearly cried, seeing his son take that kind of initiative and responsibility. They spent evenings going over the books together, Garrett explaining profit margins and operating costs, teaching Gabriel to think strategically about the future. Jillian at 11 was showing artistic talent, drawing and painting constantly, filling tablets with sketches of horses and mountains and her family. Grace encouraged it, buying proper art supplies when they could afford it, displaying Jillian's work around the house. Gregory at 4 was the charmer, able to talk his way into extra desserts and later bedtimes with an infectious smile and dramatic stories. Grace said he'd probably end up a politician or a preacher, someone who made their living with words. On Christmas Eve, 1899, with the new century looming, the Lancaster family gathered around their fireplace. Snow was falling outside, gentle and beautiful, nothing like the blizzard that had been raging the day Garrett found Grace. The children were playing with simple wooden toys Garrett had carved, and Grace was knitting while humming carols, and Garrett sat in his chair feeling overwhelmingly grateful. "What are you thinking about?" Grace asked, looking up from her knitting. That day I found you," Garrett admitted. 15 years ago, almost exactly. December 1883. I think about it sometimes and can't believe how different our lives might have been if I'd ridden a different route that day, if the storm had kept me in the last town, if I'd ignored my instinct to help. Grace set down her knitting and came to sit on the arm of his chair, leaning against him. I think about it too. How close I came to dying up there. How determined I was to bury James even if it killed me, because I couldn't imagine any other option. And then you appeared like an answer to a prayer I hadn't known to pray. Do you ever regret it? Marrying me so fast, staying in Jerome Junction instead of going on to California like you'd originally planned? Never, Grace said firmly. Not once. This life we've built, this family, this home, it's more than I ever dreamed of having. California would have just been more running, more trying to fit into someone else's vision. Here, I found my own vision. I found myself, and I found you. Garrett pulled her down into his lap, mindful of the children, and kissed her temple. I love you, Grace Turner Lancaster, more every year, which I didn't think was possible, but you keep proving me wrong. I love you too, she whispered. My cowboy who found me in the snow and gave me a reason to keep living. Gabriel looked up from his toys. Are you two being mushy again? Very mushy, Garrett confirmed, grinning. Get used to it. Jillian made a face, but she was smiling. Even Gregory toddled over, wanting to be part of the family pile, and they all ended up on the floor in front of the fire, tangled together and laughing, perfect in their imperfection. The new century brought changes. Automobiles started appearing in Jerome Junction, though they were impractical on the mountain roads. The ranch got electricity in 1902, a marvel that made evening chores so much easier. Gabriel left for university in Tucson in 1903 to study agricultural science, breaking Grace's heart even though she was proud. He promised to come home and apply what he learned to the ranch to help take it into the modern age. Jillian, at 16, in 1904 had her first serious suitor, a young man from a neighboring ranch that made Garrett want to reach for his rifle even though the boy was perfectly polite. Grace laughed at his protectiveness and reminded him that they'd have to let their daughter grow up eventually. The romance fizzled naturally when the boy's family moved to New Mexico, and Jillian decided she wasn't ready for marriage anyway, that she wanted to focus on her art. Gregory at 9 was still charming everyone, but also showing interest in the business side of ranching, asking questions about markets and contracts that impressed Garrett. The boy had a mind for numbers and negotiation that could take the ranch far if properly developed. In 1906, Grace turned 45, and Garrett threw her a surprise party, inviting everyone they'd known over the years. Mrs. Davies came, elderly now, but still sharp. Maggie Chen came with her grandchildren, having finally retired from the restaurant. The whole town seemed to show up to celebrate the woman who'd become one of Jerome Junction's most beloved citizens. During the party, Mrs. Davies pulled Garrett aside. I knew from that first day, she said, smiling. When you brought her in from the snow, the way you looked at her even then, I knew you'd marry her eventually. Was I that obvious? To someone looking, yes, but it wasn't inappropriate, young man. Don't look so worried. It was clear you cared about her well-being first, your feelings second. That's how it should be, she patted his arm. You've made each other very happy. That's rarer than you might think. That night, after everyone had gone home and the children were asleep, Grace and Garrett sat on their porch looking at stars, just like they'd done so many times before. 45 years old, Grace mused. When I was young, I thought 45 was ancient. Now I'm here and I feel like I'm just hitting my stride. You're beautiful, Garrett said. More beautiful now than the day I met you. You're biased. Completely, he agreed. But that doesn't make it less true. You've grown more confident, more yourself over the years. It radiates from you. Grace turned to him, taking his hand. Do you ever wonder what James would think of all this, of us? It was rare that she mentioned her first husband anymore. Garrett considered the question carefully. I think if he was a good man like you said, he'd be glad you were happy. Glad you survived and built a life. Maybe a little jealous, he added with a slight grin, but mostly glad. I like to think so, Grace said. I've made my peace with all of it, the grief and the guilt and the complexity. You helped me do that, letting me talk about him when I needed to, not being threatened by his memory. He was part of your story, Garrett said simply. And your story is part of mine now. All of it, even the parts I wasn't there for. They sat in comfortable silence, hands linked, watching the night sky. 23 years of marriage, Garrett thought. 23 years since that September day when they'd said vows in front of the whole town. And before that, the courting year. And before that, the winter and spring when Grace had been finding her feet and Garrett had been falling in love. Nearly a quarter century since he'd found her digging that grave. So much life had happened since then. So much joy and struggle and growth. He wouldn't trade a single moment of it. In 1908, Gabriel came home from university with a degree and a fiancée, a smart woman named Helen, who'd studied alongside him and shared his passion for modern ranching techniques. They married that summer, and Gabriel built a house on the ranch property, starting to take over more of the day-to-day operations, while Garrett gradually stepped back. Jillian, at 20, decided to open a small studio in town, selling her paintings and teaching art to local children. Grace helped her set it up, sewing curtains and organizing supplies, proud of her daughter's independence and talent. Gregory, at 13, was already talking about law school, about maybe becoming a judge someday. He had Gabriel's seriousness, but also a charisma that drew people to him. Garrett had no doubt the boy would accomplish whatever he set his mind to. In the spring of 1910, Gabriel and Helen had their first child, a daughter named Emma. Garrett held his granddaughter and felt the circle of life in a profound way. He was 55 years old, a grandfather, a successful rancher, a pillar of the community. The drifting cowboy he'd been was a distant memory. Grace at 49 was still vibrant and active, though she complained sometimes about her knees aching in cold weather. She'd taken up gardening more seriously, turning their property into a showcase of flowers and vegetables, supplying half the town with produce in summer. She was talking about writing a cookbook, collecting all the recipes she'd learned from Maggie Chen and developed herself over the years. That summer, they decided to take a trip, just the two of them. Gabriel could manage the ranch for a week, and the younger children were old enough not to need constant supervision. They packed light and rode north, up into the high country, following roughly the route that Grace had taken with James all those years ago. They found the place where Garrett had first seen Grace, the stretch of mountain pass where she'd been digging. It looked different in summer, covered in grass and wildflowers, peaceful and beautiful instead of deadly. Grace dismounted and stood there for a long moment, looking around. "I can't believe I survived," she said softly. "Looking at it now, seeing how remote it is, how far from anywhere, if you hadn't come along, I would have died within hours." "But I did come along," Garrett said, standing beside her. "Maybe it was fate. Maybe it was luck. Maybe it was God. I don't know, but I'm grateful for it every single day." Grace turned to him, eyes bright with emotion. "Let's say a prayer for James. He deserves that much." They stood together in the meadow where a man had died and a love story had begun, and they prayed for James Holloway, that he was at peace, that his sacrifice hadn't been in vain, that his brief intersection with their lives was remembered with kindness. Then Grace picked a handful of wildflowers and scattered them on the wind, a final goodbye to the husband she'd mourned, and moved beyond. "Thank you," she told Garrett as they remounted, "for bringing me here, for letting me close that door properly." "You already closed it," Garrett said, "but I understand wanting to mark it somehow." They rode on to California, to the orchard that James's brother had once owned. The brother had died years ago, they learned, and the property had been sold. But they stayed in the area for a few days, seeing the Pacific Ocean for the first time, marveling at the missions and cities, understanding why James had been drawn to this land of opportunity. "It's beautiful," Grace admitted, "but it's not home. Home is Jerome Junction, our ranch, our family. This would have just been another place to survive. Instead, I found a place to thrive." The trip home felt like a completion of something, a full circle. They arrived back to chaos, Gregory having gotten into a fight at school, Jillian having received an offer to display her work in Tucson, Gabriel and Helen announcing that another baby was on the way. Life in all its messy glory, and Garrett couldn't have been happier. The years continued their march. More grandchildren arrived, 6 in total by 1915. The ranch expanded, incorporating new techniques Gabriel had learned, becoming one of the most successful operations in the region. Gregory went off to law school in Phoenix, writing long letters home full of cases and courtroom drama. Jillian married a schoolteacher named Robert and moved to Prescott, though she visited often with their children. Grace turned 55 in 1916 and Garrett 61. They were slowing down, letting the younger generation take over more responsibilities, but they were far from finished. They still took morning rides together, still sat on the porch in evenings talking about everything and nothing, still made love with the passion of people who'd chosen each other every day for over 30 years. "Do you ever think about what you'd say to your younger self?" Grace asked one evening. "If you could go back to that day in 1883, what would you tell that cowboy riding up on a desperate widow?" Garrett considered. "I'd tell him to trust his instincts, that stopping to help is always the right choice, that the woman digging in the snow is going to become the center of his entire world, and that he should hold on tight because it's going to be the best ride of his life." "That's very poetic for you," Grace teased. "You bring it out in me," he said, pulling her close. "What would you tell your younger self?" "I'd tell her that it's okay to grieve, but it's also okay to heal. That loving again doesn't diminish what she lost, that the man who stops to help her is going to be her partner in the truest sense, that they're going to build something beautiful together. Grace laid her head on Garrett's shoulder. I'd tell her that life gets so much better than she can imagine in that moment of despair. It did get better, Garrett said. So much better. In 1918, the world was at war, and Gregory came home from law school to enlist despite Grace's tears and Garrett's concerns. He served honorably and came back in 1919, changed but whole, ready to restart his law career with a depth of experience that would serve him well. He opened a practice in Jerome Junction, serving the community his family had been part of for decades. Gabriel and Helen had taken over the ranch entirely by 1920, with Garrett and Grace fully retired to a smaller house they'd built on the property. It had a big porch and a garden and room for grandchildren to visit, which they did constantly. Garrett at 65 was still strong, still riding every day, still involved in town affairs. Grace at 59 was writing that cookbook, filling pages with recipes and stories, creating a legacy of flavors and memories. On their 40th wedding anniversary in September 1924, the whole family gathered for a massive celebration. Children and grandchildren, friends and neighbors, everyone who'd been part of their story over the decades. There were speeches and toasts, stories told and retold, laughter and tears. Gabriel stood up to speak, now a man of 38 with children of his own. My parents met in tragedy, he said. My mother had just lost her first husband. My father was a drifter looking for work. They had every reason not to work as a couple. Too much grief, two different backgrounds, too fast. But they chose each other anyway, and they kept choosing each other every single day for 40 years. They taught us what real love looks like, not the easy romantic kind, but the hard, daily kind that builds a life worth living. They taught us about resilience and partnership and grace. He raised his glass. To Garrett and Grace Lancaster, the best parents and grandparents anyone could ask for. Everyone drank and cheered, and Garrett looked at Grace with tears in his eyes. 40 years, he said wonderingly. How did we get to 40 years? One day at a time, Grace said, squeezing his hand. One choice at a time. One moment of love at a time. That night, alone in their house with the party over, they sat together in the darkness and talked about everything they'd experienced, all the joys and sorrows, all the ways they'd grown and changed together. I would do it all again, Grace said. Every single moment, even the hard ones, even the painful ones, because they all led here to this life with you. Me too, Garrett said. Finding you in that snow was the best thing that ever happened to me. Saving you saved me too, in ways I couldn't have understood then. They made love, slowly, tenderly, two people who knew each other's bodies as well as their own, who could communicate without words, who'd built a physical connection that had only deepened over 4 decades. Afterward, holding Grace against his chest, listening to her breathe, Garrett felt utterly content. The years grew shorter, but no less sweet. Garrett's health started to decline in his early 70s, his heart not as strong as it had been, his body finally showing the wear of decades of hard ranch work. Grace hovered and worried, making him rest, limiting his activities. But Garrett was stubborn about maintaining his routines. In the fall of 1928, Garrett had a heart attack while out riding. He managed to get back to the house before collapsing, and Grace was there to catch him, screaming for help. The doctor came and stabilized him, but it was clear that Garrett's time was limited. His heart was giving out, slowly but surely. He lasted through winter and into spring of 1929, growing weaker but staying present. The family gathered around, taking turns sitting with him, telling him stories, holding his hands. Grace barely left his side, sleeping in a chair next to their bed, making sure he was comfortable and loved every moment. On a bright April morning, with wildflowers blooming outside and the sun streaming through the windows, Garrett woke and knew it was his last day. He could feel it in his bones, the way animals know when weather's coming. "Grace," he whispered, and she was there immediately, taking his hand. "I'm here, my love. I'm right here." 45 years, he said, smiling weakly. Best 45 years any man could ask for. "Don't you dare try to say goodbye," Grace said, tears streaming down her face. "Don't you dare, Garrett Lancaster." "Have to," he said gently. "But Grace, listen to me. You survived before we met, and you'll survive after I'm gone. You're the strongest person I've ever known. Promise me you'll keep living, keep finding joy." "I can't promise that," she sobbed. "How can I live without you?" "The same way you lived after James," Garrett said. "One day at a time, one breath at a time, and Grace, you won't be alone. You have our children, our grandchildren, this whole community. You have the life we built together. I'll be part of it even when I'm gone." The family came in then, Gabriel and Jillian and Gregory and all the grandchildren crowding into the room to say goodbye. Garrett had words for each of them, blessings and advice, love and pride. He held his newest great-grandchild, a baby girl born just weeks before, and marveled that his line would continue, that his and Grace's love would ripple forward through generations. As evening fell and the room grew quiet, Garrett looked at Grace one last time. "Thank you," he whispered, "for everything, for letting me love you, for loving me back, for this beautiful life." "Thank you for finding me," Grace said, holding his hand against her cheek. "Thank you for stopping that day, for helping me, for seeing me when I was invisible. Thank you for every single day since." Garrett smiled, squeezed her hand weakly, and closed his eyes. His breathing slowed, became shallow, and as the sun set on another Arizona day, Garrett Lancaster took his last breath surrounded by the family he'd built, with the woman he'd found digging a grave in the snow 46 years before. Grace sat with his body for a long time, holding his hand, talking to him, saying all the things she needed to say. The family gave her space, understanding that she needed this time, this goodbye. When she finally emerged, she was composed, sad but not broken. They buried Garrett on the ranch, in a spot overlooking the valley he'd loved. The whole town came to the funeral, hundreds of people whose lives he'd touched over nearly 5 decades in Jerome Junction. Grace stood strong through the service, supported by her children, remembering her promise to Garrett to keep living. And she did. Grace lived another 14 years, staying active and engaged, watching her grandchildren grow and her great-grandchildren arrive, writing her cookbook and publishing it to local acclaim, maintaining the garden and the house and the connections that had defined her life. She never remarried, never wanted to. Garrett had been her great love, and that was enough for one lifetime. She told stories about him constantly, keeping his memory alive, making sure the younger generations knew the man who'd founded their family legacy. She told them about the day they met, about the grave in the snow, about how love could grow from the most desperate circumstances. On September 15th, 1943, on what would have been their 59th wedding anniversary, Grace gathered the family for a celebration. She was 82 years old, still sharp-minded though physically frail, and she wanted to mark the occasion one more time. "Your grandfather saved my life," she told the assembled grandchildren and great-grandchildren. "But more than that, he taught me how to truly live. He showed me that grief doesn't have to be the end of the story, that there's always possibility for new beginnings if you're brave enough to take them. He loved me with his whole heart for 45 years, and I loved him the same way. That kind of love doesn't end with death. It continues through all of you, through the lives you build, through the choices you make. Remember that. Remember that love is always worth the risk." That night, Grace went to sleep in the house she'd shared with Garrett, surrounded by photographs and memories, and she didn't wake up. The doctor said her heart just stopped, that she'd died peacefully in her sleep. The family liked to think that Garrett had finally come back for her, that after 14 years apart, they were together again. They buried her next to Garrett on the hillside, under the Arizona sky that had witnessed their entire story. The double headstone read, "Garrett Lancaster, 1855-1929, beloved husband, father, grandfather. Grace Lancaster, 1861-1943, beloved wife, mother, grandmother." And beneath both names, a simple inscription, "Found in the snow, forever in our hearts." The ranch continued through Gabriel's line, through his children and their children, staying in the Lancaster family for generations. The story of how it started, of the cowboy who found a widow digging a grave and fell in love with her, became family legend, told and retold, a reminder that the greatest love stories often begin in the most unlikely places. And in Jerome Junction, Arizona, in the high country where winter storms still rage and wildflowers still bloom, the legacy of Garrett and Grace Lancaster lived on. A testament to the transformative power of compassion, the resilience of the human heart, and the enduring nature of love that chooses to bloom even in the coldest, darkest moments.